Hello there. Today I'm taking the last in my look at the 5 premium Chardonnays coming from the Kumeu River Winery in the 2024 vintage. So we're finishing up with Mates Vineyard Chardonnay. Kumeu River's Mates Chardonnay is arguably New Zealand's leading Chardonnay. Certainly when I've looked at the Wine Searcher website. Currently it's the second most searched for New Zealand wine after Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc. And yes, it's my understanding that the name is pronounced Mates rather than Mates, which it could be read as, or equally I have heard people say Mates, but I think Mates is the correct pronunciation there. The winery is located, of course, in Kumeu, northwest of Auckland, just over 20 kilometres outside the centre of Auckland, and the winery here has been owned since its foundation in 1944 by the Brajkovich family. And the family's story is quite typical of the stories of immigrants who'd come from Dalmatia or Croatia. Mate Brajkovich's parents, Mick and Kate, had come with their son from Dalmatia prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, and they'd worked as what were referred to as gum diggers in the northern part of New Zealand. So essentially what they were doing was they were mining, often in swampland, for the resin from the huge kauri trees that grow here in New Zealand. And these were often fossilised trees. So this would have been hard and dirty work, and the family worked for almost a decade until they could afford to buy the land in Kumeu and become grape growers and winemakers. Now this hard work obviously took its toll, because in 1949 Matty's father Mick died, but Matty and his mother Kate continued working the land, and it's noted that by the mid-50s they'd paid off the mortgage here. Matty met in Melbourne, and in 1957 they married, and their first child, Michael, was born in 1960. Now there's a lovely plaque as a tribute to Mate Brajkovich at the gate of Mates Vineyard, and that refers to him as a community and a wine industry leader whose foresight and confidence in the Kumeu region, one of the premium viticultural areas for New Zealand, led him to redevelop and replant his vineyard here in 1990. I think the point was that originally the winery here had been known as San Marino. It had made its name producing wines often from hybrid grape varieties. So in I think 1986 they renamed the winery Kumeu River, and in 1990 started planting international varieties, and particularly Chardonnay, with an eye to selling not just locally but on an international market. Now the first Chardonnay grapes from Mates Vineyard were harvested in 1993. Unfortunately that was the year after he had died, so he never got to taste these wines. The wine was released in 1994, coinciding with the family having been in Kumeu for 50 years. So Mates Vineyard itself is a gentle, sheltered, north-facing slope with some quite heavy clay soils. When he planted it in 1990, the vine material here was the best that he could get, and that was a clone called Mendoza clone, although named after a town in Argentina, actually a clone that had been obtained from the United States. Trellising here is on Lyre trellising to try and ensure there's as much leaf canopy available to the plant to ripen its grapes as possible, without the potential for undue shade to diminish its ripening capacity. And today this is almost certainly the oldest vineyard planted with Mendoza clone Chardonnay anywhere in New Zealand. Unfortunately, these days the vines have Leafroll virus, which works to suppress the yields. But with careful management, they're able to make the vineyard produce some fantastic fruit. Now just talk about the 2024 vintage. 2024 followed the very challenging vintage of 2023 that had seen incredible rainfall levels. To put this in context, in January and February of 2023 in Kumeu, they'd had 525 millimetres of rain across those 2 months. 2024 saw just 49 millimetres in the same period. Now the season started really well. There was an even bud burst, and things were looking set to produce an excellent harvest. However, just on the point of flowering, there were a couple of days of cold, wet weather, and this adversely affected flowering, resulting in the setting of a much smaller crop. Now the Mendoza clone is famous for producing what are called hen and chick berries, so that a proportion of the berries don't grow to full size, and the result of that is you can end up with some really tiny berries which can add some really crisp, fresh acidity to a wine. This was somewhat accentuated by the conditions of fruit set in 2024, so I think we can expect a wine with quite bracing acidity. Now the rest of the growing season was excellent. It was mostly warm and dry. At the same time as some of the rest of New Zealand was experiencing excessive heat, conditions in Kumeu remained moderately warm. In fact, temperatures here never exceeded 29 degrees C throughout the growing season, so allowing really steady berry maturation and the gentle accumulation of flavours right through until harvest. Although the winery started harvesting Chardonnay fruit for their table wines on the 29th of February, traditionally Mates Vineyard is the last to be picked, and 2024 was no exception to this, so the fruit here would have been picked at the end of the second week of March. Picking took place in perfect conditions, and evidently the fruit was absolutely pristine when it arrived at the winery. Yields, however, were down by about 30%. One of the things about the 2024 vintage is that the conditions have enabled the production of a wine that is very typical of the style of wines that come off Mates Vineyard. The fruit was entirely hand-picked and whole bunch pressed. Now evidently that makes a big difference if you're harvesting fruit like this Mendoza clone Chardonnay that has hen and chick berries, because if you machine harvest, those berries stay on the vine. Similarly, if you destem the fruit, the majority of those tiny berries don't make their way into the final juice. The juice was entirely fermented in barrel. Fermentation resulted entirely from the action of indigenous yeasts that had found their way into the winery on the fruit, or might already have been acting in the winery. The barrels being used were Burgundy PS barrels, so normally about 228 litre barrels, from a range of top French coopers, and there was a relatively high proportion of new oak being used for Mates Vineyard. I can't find the exact number in my notes, but I believe it was about 40%. Having fermented in barrel, the wine stayed in barrel for malolactic conversion, then continued to age with its lees in the barrel, being stirred up occasionally, for a further 11 months. And stirring up the dead yeast lees, keeping them in suspension with the wine, helps protect the wine during aging from oxidation, but also helps to feed the wine. As the yeast breaks down, it releases sugars and proteins into the wine that help give a lovely roundness to the texture. So let's have a look at it and see what we make of it. The colour there is a pale to medium yellow. The wine is, according to its label, 13.5% alcohol. As I'm swirling it, it's clinging to the glass there, and very gradually, there we go, starting to throw some tear onto the glass there. So that indicates this is a wine of some density. Looking at the colour again, almost sort of glints of green there. It's a lovely vibrant colour. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas have a concentration and a focus. The first thing that strikes me is there's a lime note, lime flower, something sort of slightly more high-toned there. Moving on from that, start to see a touch of richness and ripeness in the fruit notes with a little bit of white peach. And then behind that, all beautifully married, there are some hints of vanilla and cedar from the oak, a certain amount of creaminess coming from the lees aging. But all those elements are seamlessly together. It's very attractive. So let's have a taste. Now the palate manages to combine pungency and richness. There really is a burst of crisp, limey acidity coming through there. But at the same time, there's quite an explosion of ripe stone fruit, and the two of those sort of acting together, meeting in the middle with a creaminess that the fruit's managing to be rounded, rich, full-bodied, and yet at the same time lively and fresh. It's giving some lovely length. Now in the mid-palate there's a little bit of cedary tannin that's interacting with the acidity and giving a really mouth-watering nature to the mid-palate. The finish goes on, you've got creamy notes, you've got butterscotchy notes. They're all softening, smoothing, and rounding out the oak influence that's coming in there. Flavours do last really well. They're really buoyed up by this mouth-watering acidity. There's a mineral nature to it. There are lingering limey notes. But as it opens, what you're actually finishing with is that peachiness. This is a wine that ideally I think you'd probably leave for 5 to 7 years before drinking to get it at its best, because I think that's when those richer, peachy stone fruit notes will actually be expressing themselves more powerfully. However, I am struck by quite how attractive this is already. Looking at the 5 wines I've tried from Kumeu River already, 2 of them, the Rays Road and the Coddington, have struck me as very forward, tropical, with some real instant appeal, whereas the estate wine and the Hunting Hill have seemed to be more reserved, more mineral, and wines more in need of aging before drinking. Somehow, Mates seems to manage to combine both those aspects, such as its concentration of fruit, but also that fantastic underlying acidity that's just buoying everything up and giving so much life to the wine. This is a fabulous example of a good vintage of top Chardonnay, and one that could age in your cellar probably for 10 years very happily, continuing to show more and more of its dimensions as it develops. At the same time, you also have the dilemma that its instant appeal will require self-control to enable you to do that. I had a look at Wine Searcher, and they do have a critic score for this. I'm reluctant to call it an aggregated critic score because it's only from a single critic, and that's a score of 96. However, I have also seen Aaron Larkin, who tastes for Robert Parker's The Wine Advocate, has given this a score with the bracket of 95 to 97. So I think 96 seems to be a fairly well accepted score for this. I would actually argue that the wine is probably worth 97 out of 100. I really do think this is an exceptional wine that tops off a wonderful set of 5 Chardonnays from Kumeu River in 2024. It's been a delight tasting them. I hope you've enjoyed the tastings. I will of course leave a link to the webpage for this wine on the Wine Searcher website so you can find out if it's available near you and at what price. If you've enjoyed watching the tasting, do please leave me a like. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, it would be fabulous if you'd consider subscribing to my channel and signing up to follow it. If you do that, do set yourself an alert, and that way you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any comments, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the videos as well, do please feel free to forward them. I really would appreciate your support in that way. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope you'll make some time, come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.